Welcome to another Boyish Rant. For episode 20, I wanted to do something special, seeing as the year 2020 is content with socially and economically fisting the planet. I'm left with a bitter taste in my mouth for the number 20. So with that in mind, I wanted to cover the last 19 Boyish Rants and see just how each topic has progressed since I made the video. First, I wanted to give a little backstory on these Boyish Rants. Don't ask me why I've waited till episode 20 to explain it, but during my late 20s, I found myself becoming quite embittered at the idiocracy, hypocrisy, and borderline malevolence of certain figures in the public sphere, with the mainstream media being almost complicit in their inadequacy. Ranting was one of the only ways that I could process these actions. Making a video is just a byproduct of me coming to terms with the social and political structure of my country that I'd stayed ignorant to for so many years. And I'm a firm believer that humour is one of the best forms of communication when dealing with spicy topics like race or human rights issues. And I may have received my fair amount of criticism over the last 19 rants, but the majority has been positive, with the latter being reserved for those who are just too ingrained in their own ideology. And fuck them. But before I get into my first rant, I wanted to thank anybody who's ever watched my videos. I'm grateful for every view, like, and share. And don't worry, as long as the planet seems set on social seppuku, I'm going to keep making rants. Anyway, let's go back to February 2019, when times were so much more simpler. The UK was kind of still in the EU, Boris Johnson wasn't Prime Minister, and nobody had even heard the term COVID-19. Well, except the Chinese government. So let's start off with Brexodus. Honestly, I took the rest of the day off when I thought of that title, where I covered a number of British MPs who had left their own parties to start a new political party despite being elected on the manifestos, policies and principles of the former parties. The Independent Group for Change didn't last all that long, being dissolved less than 10 months after its creation, after all its MPs lost in the general election of 2019. I've been doing these rants for longer than 10 months. Local mouthpiece and child snatcher Anna Soubry dissolved the party in November after each of their MPs lost their seats to the party that they quit to join Change UK. Oh, it's so poetic. Many MPs, including Heidi Bang-Tidy, quit the Change UK party and joined more sideline parties such as like the Lib Dems or the Green Party, leaving only 3 people supporting the cause. But this is what you get when you create a political party based on undemocratic policies and being run by insipid turncoats whose greatest achievement was soapbox politics with every toy they own being thrown out the pram. God, I fucking hate Tories. Next up was foul play. This may have been the squeakiest my bum has ever been during recording, and also maybe too big of a whale for me to attempt to harpoon so early on in my ranting timeline. I'd spoken to a good friend of mine, Jonko, that this story might have been a bit too naive to try and tackle at the time, but I don't know, maybe at the time I just thought it was too big of a topic not to cover. The story was trans activists were attempting to cancel Martina Navratilova over some facts that she had stated that they just didn't like hearing. This, even at the time, and even worse now, has become a growing trend, especially in America. Luckily, since then, Martina Navratilova has gone from strength to strength. And all of the hot air created by far left activists just atrophied into nothing. Because it turns out basing your argument on, I don't like what you just said, isn't a great position to argue from. Martina Navratilova continues to be an icon in the sport. Recently she received praise about how she dealt with all these attacks, and she's now inducted into the Tennis Hall of Fame. So it's good to know that, at least in tennis, the powers that be are willing to support the truth, the integrity of the game, and their athletes by not pandering frivolous expressions of emotional pain by pussies without pussies who get hurt more by words than actual violence. The Gulling covers the story of John Llewellyn-Jones as he protected himself and his chips from that almighty beast, the seagull. Granted, with the benefit of hindsight, the way he went about it may have been a bit extreme. But, who hasn't grabbed somebody by the legs and smashed them against the wall to protect their chips? You show me that and I'll show you a liar. Or John Llewellyn-Jones. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any articles or stories concerning this particular incident, and the only thing I was able to dig up was a Twitter thread of people agreeing with Mr. Jones's actions. The British tabloids pretty much said, he killed bird, he pay fine, story over. Which sounds about right for the extent of their enthusiasm for a story that can't be twisted into clickbait. I did find this story though, and I'm going to assume that there's no such thing as hereditary animal violence. I'm going to assume that Lee Jones and John Llewellyn Jones aren't related. Lee Jones is a twat that kicked an injured seagull. John Llewellyn Jones is a goddamn hero with the reflexes of Miyagi. Episode 420, Jar Bless the NHS, started out as me talking about the amount of antidepressants that have been prescribed in the UK. Now, sadly, that number's only gotten worse, seeing as the country teeters on an anxiety attack so much recently due to global events. Then it kind of turned into me advocating medical marijuana as a treatment for some mental health issues. Not all, but some. Sadly, the NHS has had much bigger things to deal with since then, and so handing out CBD prescriptions isn't at the top list of priorities at the moment, which is fine. Rant 5, Bastard Royale, covered the Tory leadership campaign. And I think we all know how that one turned out. Although it is interesting looking back to see which of the candidates got a place in Boris's cabinet, because it's only about half of them. Nothing much else really to mention about this one other than I was split on the title between Bastard Royale and Battle of the Bastards. Either way, the Tories are bastards. Bastards. Bastard. Bastard. Comrade Corbyn's Labour camp. I feel a wee bit saddened looking back on this one. Although I can understand where I was coming from at the time, I had no intention of making this video my longest rant. Or, in some ways, my most bitter. I did actually vote for Corbyn whilst he was the leader twice overall. And I was in full support of him when he seemingly popped up out of nowhere to challenge Theresa Mayhem. Now, there was a windfall of bad press for Corbyn after he left the leadership, and it's possible that in the interest of impartiality, I overlooked the fact that I, myself, was joining in kicking the shit out of an old man who just hates money. Since taking a step back from leadership, Corbyn's biggest press problem has been dealing with a doppelganger who's been terrorising his son with a fucking hammer. I mean, this story is complete tripe, yet it's giving front page access. I mean, just look at this guy they fucking caught on CCTV. He looks like Bernard Cribbins, who, yeah, admittedly kind of looks like Corbyn. And I know I made a lot of communism jokes during this rant, but what you have to realise is jokes about communism are only funny if everyone gets them. Rant number 7 covered the possibility of Scottish independence. Now, I tried to be as impartial as I could with this one, but in all honesty, I'm still all for you guys getting your lands back and the English can get to fuck with their nukes. Now, since I made my rant, the support for Scottish independence seems to be on the rise. Growing faster than a lesion on a Scottish liver, it seems a fair amount of this support seems to have been garnered by Scotland's reaction to COVID-19, which, in case you weren't aware of, was far better than England's. In fact, there's only a small handful of countries that England did react better than. But this is about Scotland, and through dialogue with differing and certain parties, looking at you, Scatter, I've learned far more than I knew before making this particular video, and even though I've debated both sides, I still remain in support of you boys in Tartan getting your lands back, and in all likelihood, rebuilding Hadrian's Wall. Rant 8 was an odd one. I've never had to re-explain my position so much on a video before. My argument was that there are dozens of different ways that we can save the planet from global warming that are far more economical than simply going vegan. And yet I found myself having to debate people from a position that I had seemingly placed myself into, like I'd inadvertently straw-manned myself, which is not a wise thing to do, nor is it an advantageous place to argue a point from. So, just to clarify, I have no problems with vegans. I'm very content to live and let live. But if you're going to argue that a vegan diet is better for the planet than renewable clean energy, I will eat you alive. And at some point, this rant turned into me advocating cannibalism, which was a joke, by the way. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, yet since this video, I've seen my fair share of clickbait articles involving cannibalism of some shape or form. Rant number 9 was about old bonging Boris winning the Tory leadership election. So, what's Boris been like since he became the PM? For ease on this one, I'll just look at Boris's handling of COVID, as I feel a lot of what Boris says and a lot of what Boris does is reflected in the way he's responded to the coronavirus pandemic. Well, one thing Boris does do well is mince words. This has led a barrage of mixed messages being released to the public from the cabinet. Even initially, Health Secretary Mancock thought that masks did nothing to prevent the spread of corona. And Mancock is the Secretary of Health. Boris also refused to lock down when the experts told him to. This has now led to the UK having a death toll as of recording this video, of 44,000, with a mortality rate of 14%. We're supposed to be a fucking first world country, and for the majority of this pandemic, this fucking big blubbering floppy blonde tit Boris has had our mortality rate the same as fucking Mozambique. As lockdowns began worldwide, Boris still allowed flights from China to the UK, despite places like Australia banning them 6 weeks earlier. Recently, Boris laid a quarantine period on travellers from Australia to the UK. Now, just for comparison, Australia has maybe 8,000 cases since the start of this, and I think just under 100 deaths right now. Yet, if you fly from there to the UK, which we are now getting close to 1,000 new cases a day again, you have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks. Fucking explain that to me. Explain that to me, you fat fuck. Number 10. I think this one felt the most righteous to me up to that point. God, the video quality of these rants really differs, doesn't it? If on one thing, it's consistently inconsistent. Now, I know in this one I made a lot of pedo jokes about Prince Andrew and Prince Philip, Prince Charles, but in all seriousness, I don't regret anything I said in this video. I may have received a little bit of shit about my Prince Harry joke, but that's mostly from people who are conflating the target of a joke with the subject of a joke, and as far as I'm concerned, those people can develop Lou Gehrig's disease. And this may have been a rant that I received the most support after making, with a lot of people my age agreeing with the sentiments I made in the video. You know, a lot of older folks getting the hump over pretty much any criticism of the royal family, let alone calling them paedophilic succuba. Since this video, nothing much has happened with the royals. Ghislaine Maxwell has popped up in the news, so Prince Andrew's sweating again. Or not sweating, or I don't know. It was the most confusing interview of all time. The press are trying desperately to keep some form of Markle beef alive while ignoring the fact that Prince Philip looks like a fucking ghoul. Or better yet, Rant 11 covered the Labour leadership election, running through all of the candidates. And like I said in the video, I'm not mad that Corbyn stepped down as leader of the party. Although he did a lot to popularise the party's image, I think to a certain extent even he realised that he just wasn't popular enough to get the big boy prize, which is a missed opportunity really. Nevertheless, Labour members voted Sir Keir Starmer as leader of the party. So how's he been since he got elected? Well, he's got the endorsement of a bunch of celebrities like we're fucking America or something, and not to be funny, but I have a general rule to instinctively disagree with anything Jeremy Clarkson says. I think he's a massive prick, but not just any prick. He's a curly-haired, fat fucking prick. Some would say it's too soon to judge the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer, that only if he becomes Prime Minister will we truly see the size of his huevos. And I'm inclined to agree. I reckon we should give him a chance before we judge. He did recently slip in a dig to Dominic Cummings recently in an interview by drinking an IPA called Barnard Castle Eye Test. Cummings famously broke lockdown procedures twice, driving 300 miles for an eye test. For those who don't know, Dominic Cummings is Boris Johnson's right-hand cunt. Rant 12 started out as a rant about how consistently shit the weather had recently been in Britain, which, if anything, shows how truly bitter I am that the weather is enough to make me record a rant. But this one sort of turned into a tirade about climate change. And, well, since I made this video, things have kind of only gotten worse. There's been small changes here or there, but not enough large-scale changes are being made on an industrial scale to actually have any large impact. Personally, I think it's too late for Earth's climate. I think we should stop fucking about and start investing in seagull traps, floating seasteads and drinkable urine. Because seemingly the idea of spending billions to destroy the planet is more appetising than spending billions to save it. And we can attempt to colonise Mars, but if we're doomed to make the same mistakes we made here on Earth, combined with whatever new problems Mars is going to throw at us, we should just pile up our money in the centre of town and set a light to it to keep warm in the coming ice age, Pablo Escobar style. This one turned out to be a little bit too spicy for some people. I had actually contemplated renaming this rant recently when I saw that Donald Trump used the phrase Kung Flu at a rally in Florida when he was addressing COVID-19. We've got China virus, a Kung Flu. Now, jokes aside, my main point with this rant was just to try and get more people to wash their hands. It sounds very trivial until you realise that the UK government at the time of making this was handing out contradictory advice left, right and centre. Granted, I may have got a couple of things wrong, which is why I normally like to sit on a rant for a couple of days just to see if any new information comes out so we can get a bigger picture. What's that phrase? I like to see the entire elephant. Now, 4 months ago when I made this video, the UK had 51 cases and 1 death. We're now pushing 1/3 cases since this began and 44,000 deaths. That puts us third in the world for COVID-related deaths. Third. Do you remember when I spoke of Italy? Do you remember when I mentioned that it was getting fisted up the ravioli hole by COVID-19? Scrap that, because Boris has apparently sunk it into his head to destroy every record that Italy set with COVID cases, deaths and mortality rate. My 14th rant was supposed to be a bit more wholesome than it was. Shortly after Boris called lockdown, a thin layer of anxiety seemed to descend over the nation as we all entered unfamiliar territory. Hilariously, I start this video off by going, well, 6 weeks of lockdown. 6 weeks? Bitch, please! Almost 3.5 months later, and the country is still pretty much medically radioactive. I know we've got pubs opening back up, but I don't think we should be becoming a bit too lax right now. You know, let's leave that to America. And while there are some aspects of the British economy reopening, I'm still off work for the foreseeable future. Seemingly, it takes this government a week to try and process and release inadequate information, and then another week for them to realise and fix what they got wrong. Just fucking Tories! Paranoid Android. Thankfully, Radiohead haven't sued over that title. In this rant, I cover the new emergency powers being granted to the Tory government in order to tackle the spread of coronavirus, from increased surveillance to data mining. At first, I made the argument that most governments, like the Tories, will happily accept most emergency powers that you hand them, but aren't too psyched about handing those powers back once you're out of the crisis period, once they've seen that the new reach and control that these new powers bestow upon them. Now, the argument could be made that these are innocent powers, and if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about. This is an incredibly naive argument. It's tantamount to saying, I'm not racist, so racism doesn't exist. Now, in good news regarding this topic, the police using these powers were able to infiltrate a top-secret criminal organisation, build cases and arrest over 700 people with cases of drug smuggling, sex trafficking and money laundering. Nationally, the UK police confiscated over £54 million, which is not bad. I mean, they did also arrest a number of corrupt police and figures in political positions, but obviously their names haven't been released to the public. To this day, the emergency surveillance schemes set up by the government are still in use, seemingly being used for good and evil. So, for better or worse, these powers are a double-edged sword, and I don't know if I want Boris to be the one swinging that fucker about. Rant 16 wasn't a long one at all, really, but damn if it wasn't a crazy one. I covered a story of a monkey attack of a lab assistant in New Delhi. Now, at the time, I thought we were looking at the sequel to COVID-19, where some new simian illness plagues the planet and we end up with a planet of the monkeys. Granted, I watch far, far too many movies. Because it turns out it's not Planet of the Monkeys you need to worry about. It's Planet of the Pigs, like we're in a goddamn Duke Nukem game from the 90s or something. Never mind all these stories and rumours of a new novel mutated strain already in circulation. Rant 17. Black Lives Matter, some statues do not. I think we all kind of know how this situation has progressed since I made the video. Humanity can't stop protesting. American police can't stop killing unarmed blacks, which is making more people protest. And the whole situation is being exacerbated by Donald Trump acting like a barbarous, draconian dictator in response to it all. We've seen some justice in some unjust killings of black civilians, but like a lot of things, there's still a long way to go and a lot of dialogue that needs to be had. Out of the 14 unjust killings by American police this year, only 5 have been resolved with any form of punishment for the authoritative figures involved. There has also been some decline in the ability to get the right message out of these protests, with a number of them being hijacked by far left activists and extremists with far more extreme messages. And a lot of these messages certainly feel a bit more at place in America, which I think is why it's a bit more of a trending topic over there still. Though with so many social acts and results this year in America, I find myself shaking my head at the sheer perplexity of the situation. Ah, the far right. Something I get accused of being at least once a fortnight since I started making these videos. Now, there actually has been a fair amount to do with this since I made the rant. In fact, one of the pictures that I showed of a twat taking a piss against a memorial made front page news. Andrew Banks from Essex, unsurprising, got sentenced to 14 days in custody after travelling to London to protect memorials and ended up taking a piss up against one instead. One of the best parts of this story is that Andrew Banks' explanation is that he was up all night drinking 16 pints of beer and he hadn't slept the night before. I mean, I know if I'm travelling a long distance to take part in a social protest that I care about, I get fucking shit-faced the night before, no hours sleep, just so I'm super fresh to tackle the difficult social issues of the day. Then, finally, there's Chaz. Or Chop. They now changed the name the day after I released the fucking rant. Turns out, people hear the term autonomous zone and think, oh great, we can bring in tanks, and people go, oh, it's an occupied protest now. What started out as quite an interesting experiment to view from the outside soon devolved into this sort of first world slum where disproportionate hierarchies were put in place by people protesting against hierarchies. Social structures were put in place by people who supported the abolition of social structures. Now, the whole notion of Chaz is great on paper until you realise that it's an idea formed by an American in America. And I don't know if you know anything about Americans, but they really like their fucking guns. Some Americans like to make the argument with tea, like, oh, what's British culture without tea? And this argument conveniently forgets that tea doesn't kill people in the hundreds every day, and nobody's going to war over fucking tea. Well, I know we in America did, but, you know, that was a long time ago, and who's to say who's right in that scenario anyway? Us! Anyway, back to Chaz. Seattle police have taken back a large portion of the autonomous zone, as most of its occupants are fleeing like vegan wraps from a sinking soy ship. And if America is the TV show that the rest of the world can follow along with its characters and storylines, Chaz was the spin-off show that only ever got one season, because so many of its main protagonists kill too many characters. Bringing me to the end of all my rants so far. The subject of this episode? Nostalgic rants on previous endeavours. No lesson or grand arc to ponder on, just good times. You know, I found I'm certainly more open-minded since starting this series. Certainly more dialogue has been had on almost every single topic that I've covered, some being helpful and constructive, whilst others are just merely dismissive and contradictive. But forgetting the latter for now, the debates that I've been fortunate enough to take part in have been excellent every time. And maybe that's the lesson here. In a world of suffering and malevolence, just be excellent to each other.